angles, and finally I called the help desk, and they told me how to get into it.
How
So
to
I
get
haven't
in.
had any problems yet.
Good, good. All right, guys, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right.
Morning.
Morning. So we're going to talk about chapter 20 today. Um, of course, everybody knows UTEP's networks are down. Still no access to email. At least on the faculty side, the faculty can access their email. I've heard that some students were able to access their email if they go through Microsoft Office. But I haven't had access to my email since last Friday. So hopefully you guys all read my message on Blackboard. I extended the due dates of last week's assignments, so you can finish those up this week if you need to. And we're just gonna push on through and finish up our work for chapter 20 this week and the crash course video on the Roaring Twenties. Then we go into spring break next week, and hopefully everything will be cleared up by the time we get back, because the week after spring break is important. We'll do our midterm review and then your midterm the week after that. You guys have any questions for me before I get started on chapter 20?
None for me. Thank you, Professor.
Great.
Yes,
All
I
right,
was.
well, what's up,
When are you
Alex?
gonna be? When you gonna be having the midterm?
Your midterm is week 10, I believe. Check your syllabus. It's on there. I know the week we get back from spring break, you do your review, and then the week after that is your midterm.
Okay.
There'll be plenty of announcements and stuff on our Blackboard about it, though, so it won't sneak up on you.
Okay.
Will there
Thank you.
also be like not necessarily study guides, but some sort of review material other than the meeting itself?
Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna give you guys a study guide, a review of terms, and all of the multiple choice questions from the exam come from the list of terms that I give you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. And then also on top of that, I'm gonna offer an extra credit opportunity. If you fill out the study guide, give me notes on each of the terms, it's worth up to 25 points extra credit. So we'll talk about that after spring break, though. I'll write you guys a detailed message on our Blackboard of how to complete that extra credit, how to complete the midterm review. We'll go into logistics of the midterm and the lockdown browser, everything you need to know after spring break.
Great. Thank you. So will spring break be an actual break in this class?
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Have you guys been assigned work over spring break in your other classes?
Reviews for one
Reviews?
chemistry
Okay.
class.
Yeah,
Reviews
it'll
and like
actually.
on,
What's up, Isaac?
oh no, just on like 3 of my other classes. They're like spring break, but you need to study, and I'm like, it makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah, that's tough. But for this one, you won't have to worry about anything, and we'll get started on midterm material after spring break. All right, guys, let's get into chapter 20. Whoops. Sorry about that. All right, so we talked about World War I last week. We talked about the Treaty of Versailles. That will come up again, so make sure you guys understand the Treaty of Versailles, its impact on on Europe, its impact on political borders in Europe, and basically setting the stage for future conflict in Europe. Make sure you understand the two sides of the League of Nations debate, joining these sort of international cooperatives to support international peace and international trade and freedom of the seas and so forth. But we also talked about the growing opposition to this idea and a group of Republicans in Congress that are increasingly isolationists. So today we're going to talk about really the rise of those Republicans gaining national prominence in the 1920s through the Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover administrations. We'll talk about economic expansion during the 1920s, this sort of decade of prosperity, and how this all sort of sets the economic parameters that will lead to not only a national economic recession, but a global depression due to a lot of these short-sighted economic policies. All right, so our first president in the 1920s is Warren G. Harding. He is elected in 1920, takes office in 21. He is very much a traditional sort of Gilded Age Republican, believes in isolationism, was very opposed to the League of Nations, supports isolationist economic policies like high tariffs, focuses on domestic manufacturing, cutting income taxes, especially for the rich, cutting corporate taxes, trying to make up the money that we lose, the revenue that we lose on corporate taxes and capital gains taxes by charging foreign companies more to sell their products in the United States. And another big component of this isolationist platform is cutting off immigration. So closing the border, tightening immigration, and really focusing on internal issues, internal economic growth, opposing too many foreign entanglements. So he actually runs on the platform of a return to normalcy after World War I. And this really sort of speaks to this idea of pandering to people who are really nationalists, right? Who want to focus on national issues, who want to focus on isolation, who don't think it's our business to be involved in an imperial war halfway around the world. And so he sort of promoted himself as healing the nation after World War I. Famously said, not a submergence in internationality, but sustainment in triumphant nationality. So this concept of nationalism has been around for a long time, really since the ratification of the Constitution, right? It's about the function of the federal government, and should the government be involved in promoting international relationships and affairs? Should it be involved in promoting a international agenda or geopolitical affairs, or should it be focused on domestic issues? It's really nationalism versus globalism, right? Which in the 1920s was still a very applicable argument. Nowadays, with almost 7 billion people in the world and this sort of globalization process after the advent of the internet and new geopolitical dynamics, globalism is increasingly influential in politics across the world. But this nationalism and isolationism was very much a platform of these 1920s Republicans. On top of that, it was all about the government providing opportunities for businesses to flourish. This is a return to laissez-faire economic policies. Both Harding and Coolidge are very strong, staunch proponents of letting the market regulate itself, laissez-faire economics. While Hoover is a bit on the fence about it, but it's really a man named Andrew Mellon that influences Hoover's economic policies, and we'll talk about him a bit later. All right, so under the Warren G. Harding administration, his administration is wrought with scandal. Probably most notably is the Teapot Dome scandal, which is about a man named Albert Bacon Fall, who was the Secretary of the Interior, who was caught giving rights to the Teapot Dome oil fields in Wyoming to companies that were giving him kickbacks for access to this oil. So basically, Albert Bacon Fall was exploiting his position as the Secretary of the Interior, taking bribes from oil companies. Eventually, the Mammoth Oil Company gives him $500,000, which he pockets, and then gives the Mammoth Oil Company access to the Teapot Dome oil fields, which is worth millions and millions, eventually billions of dollars. So that's sort of a blight on Harding's relationship with business. He is really seen as this laissez-faire president who believes that the government's only function in economics is cutting taxes, letting the market regulate itself. He's not going to pursue monopolies. He's not going to pursue trusts. He isn't going to go after the railroads. So in many ways, these policies will return economic conditions in the United States to conditions prior to the progressive movement. Many people would use these policies of Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Andrew Mellon as an example that the progressive movement really failed. Also during the 1920s, Republicans experience a majority in the House. They dominate the House through 28, actually through 32. So it's very easy to pass Republican legislation, which is mainly tied to anti-immigration, pro-business legislation, go through huge corporate tax cuts, try to balance the federal budget, and of course, pass the first laws directly targeting foreign immigrants. All right, so we're going through a significant economic recession after the war. Harding takes office in 21. The economy is struggling because of this post-war economic recession, but we really have the infrastructure in place to be a major economic force or a major capitalist force in the world. That's because of Fordisms, the moving assembly line, a lot of these progressive accomplishments in labor unions being able to collectively bargain for the working class. We have more and more efficient technologies. We talked about how during the Gilded Age and Progressive era, we're really sort of leading the world in technological innovation. So all of these sort of set the stage for us to be a major economic force in the capitalist world. We start to move into new industries in the 1920s. Electronics and chemicals and pharmaceuticals becomes a huge industry in the 1920s. Of course, we're leading the world in aviation. This is another big industry. Automobile production is really what our economy is based on in the 1920s. By 1929, half of all American families own a car. This is more than any other society in the world. And this reliance on the automobile not only directly affects the economy based on these car companies and the jobs that they provide, but it also stimulates production in several other industries, right? Rubber and oil and steel and these other transportation infrastructures and road construction and service stations and gas stations. All of these are being boosted by the automobile industry, which is incredibly proficient by the 1920s. Also, transportation is important for sort of bringing or concerting America's economy. More and more Americans are traveling with the automobile. It sort of reduces the isolation of rural Americans. If you can own a car as a rural American, you can still go to town and participate in consumerism. So the automobile has significant impact on America's economy. The dollar in the 1920s surpasses the pound in international trade. We start to see the dollar be a standard that other currencies are set by. And so this is all sort of setting the stage for continued economic expansion after we get over the post-World War I recession. And in 22, the economy starts to pick up. And these isolationist policies, cutting corporate taxes, increasing tariffs on foreign products, really sort of get the credit for the economic upturn. So because of this, Warren G. Harding's successor, Calvin Coolidge, continues these same policies, and it's very easy for him to get reelected in 24. Warren G. Harding dies of a heart attack in 23, and Coolidge takes over, and then he's elected in 24. And it's very easy for him to get elected because Americans see these Republican economic policies as the sort of saving grace of America's economy. On top of that, what's really fueling manufacturing is that there's a major expansion in consumerism as well. This is the first time in American history that we see evidence of Americans willing to go into debt for consumer products, meaning that they're willing to go into debt, personal debt, in order to buy things. prior to this, really the only reason you would go into debt was to buy land, right? To have a mortgage or a deed on a tract of land. Well, now Americans are willing to go into debt to buy a radio, to buy a car, to buy, kitchen appliances, and fashion becomes much more important in American popular culture in the 1920s. On top of that, Americans have very easy access to credit. This is the first time that stores start to issue credit cards specific to the store. Also, banks start to issue credit lines for car payments and things like that, for buying cars and things like that. This is very much fueled by the radio, which increases Americans' access to consumer products, or exposure to consumer products, I suppose. And it also leads to the rise of popular culture. This is an interesting advent in the 1920s, where we see popular culture start to have a significant impact on society, on trends, and so forth. You had the advent of sports celebrities. This is mainly because of the radio as well. Americans across the country know who, Ty Cobb is, and Babe Ruth becomes the biggest celebrity in America in the 1920s. Babe Ruth is an interesting story. So he's sort of one of these first darlings of the marketing industry, right? Babe Ruth can sell any product because he is so revered by the American public. And so it's one of the first times they realize, well, we can try to take advantage of this popular culture movement and tie our products to specific celebrities, whether they be sports celebrities or radio personalities, what have you. You also start to see the advent of the American film industry. We come to dominate the film industry in the world in Hollywood, California. Prior to World War I, the film industry was, or the largest film industry was in Paris, France. But we know that France was largely destroyed during the war. It takes them a long time to recuperate from the war, allowing for California and Hollywood in particular to take advantage and fill the demand for motion pictures. These huge motion picture companies start to pop up in California. You start to have big celebrities like Charlie Chaplin, who's really sort of the first great motion picture celebrity in American popular culture. Very interesting figure, Charlie Chaplin. Was sort of a physical comedian, but his films were also very politically motivated. They also contained a lot of social commentary and political commentary. The reason he grew that mustache in some of his later films was to make fun of Adolf Hitler. He often satirized fascism. He often criticized, the American corporate system. A lot of his movies are about, the working man standing up to the machine that sort of controls him, this corporate machine that's holding the working man down. He's a very sort of prominent social thinker and includes a lot of social and political commentary in his films. He's actually accused of his sympathies with communism and accused of being a communist in the 1940s, as these issues of communism and capitalism become more and more prominent on a global stage. He's targeted and actually blacklisted, ostracized from Hollywood. United Artists becomes the biggest movie studio in the world. He actually started that, but they strip him of all of his ownership and he's forced to move to Switzerland. It's a very sort of tragic end to his story, but he represents this sort of advent of popular culture. People like Charlie Chaplin and Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey and these sort of these public figures that are really members of popular culture. And they're very much the catalyst for all of that was the radio. We start to have radio stars. The most popular radio program of the 1920s was the Amos and Andy Show. Very racist depiction of Black people in the South. It was, they often traveled around the country doing what are known as minstrel performances, where they paint their faces black and act demonstratively to ridicule Black culture, incredibly racist. And that shows you the sort of racial dynamics of the racial climate of the country in the 1920s, where something blatantly racist, making fun of Black people, is the #1 most popular radio show of the entire decade. One interesting episode of American popular culture that I'm not sure your book covers deals with the 1919 Black Sox scandal. Let me flip through here real quick and see if they cover it. I'm not sure they do. But basically, the Black Sox scandal surrounds the Chicago White Sox, who are one of the best teams in the MLB. No, it doesn't look like they do. One of the best teams in Major League Baseball. They were they had some of the biggest stars. Their biggest star was a man named Shoeless Joe Jackson. They were nicknamed the Black Sox because their owner, a man named Kaminsky, I believe, would charge his players to wash their uniforms. So the players, in a way to sort of challenge the authority, wouldn't wash their uniforms, and they'd go out in dirty uniforms all the time. So they got the nickname the Black Sox, even though they were the Chicago White Sox. Charles Comiskey was his name. I think the White Sox ballpark is still Kaminsky Park. So anyway, they got the nickname the Black Sox. And we also talked about how organized crime is really coming into prominence in the 1920s because of the liquor industry. That the liquor industry is given billions of dollars of revenue to organized crime syndicates who are gaining more and more power, especially in big urban cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, etc. So a man named Arnold Rothstein, who is a racketeering gangster, mafioso from New York, approaches the Black Sox and offers each of the players on the starting lineup, 8 out of the 9 players in the starting lineup, money to throw the World Series. They give them $100,000 each, which is more money than they're being paid. This is sort of an interesting depiction of these labor disputes among the Black Sox players who don't think they're being paid fairly, the ownership class who doesn't think they need to pay these players. And so they go to the mafia to get paid under the table. They throw the World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. It's very obvious that they're throwing the World Series, and they're caught. And they're actually put on trial in front of Congress, which shows you how important baseball is to American society, that Congress is somehow involved with this scandal in baseball. And that 1919 World Series that they threw is sort of seen as the death of America's great love affair with baseball as our preeminent pastime. Anyway, just sort of an interesting story. All right, let's get back into consumerism. This economic expansion in the 1920s will result in similar stratifications that we saw in the Gilded Age, where we start to see a major gap between the rich and the poor. This is largely due to cutting corporate taxes, cutting capital gains taxes, allowing corporate magnates to assume huge wealth, which then hurts the distribution of wealth throughout society, right? A concentration of wealth will lead to income stratification and kill the middle class, just like it did during the Gilded Age. All right. Also during the 1920s, the stock market becomes increasingly popular. So Americans are beginning to participate in the stock market that don't understand the intricacies of capitalist economic systems. Corporations will start to offer their employees stock options as part of their pay or part of their benefits. This in many ways introduces many Americans to the stock market. At the same time, these Republicans are preaching this idea that American capitalist growth will never end, that the stock market has successfully regulated itself, that Republicans have figured out the intricacies of these capitalist markets, and the market will continue to grow forever and everybody will make money off of it. What they don't really understand is these complex concepts of aggregate demand, these concepts of looking at the economy from a macro instead of a micro level. We'll get into that when we get into the Great Depression. So because of this, Americans are becoming involved in the stock market, and they are recklessly investing savings in a stock market that we'll find out by 1929 is a very unstable market. This is also because of lack of government regulation. We'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, so Cal takes over, Silent Cal, Cal Coolidge takes over in 23 after Warren G. Harding dies of a heart attack. And he continues the business practices, these pro-business practices, tax breaks for corporations that were supported by Warren G. Harding. He's very anti-union as well. This is another component of 1920s Republican economic agendas. They're very anti-union. They believe they want to strip the power of collective bargaining from unions, and really wanted unfettered business growth, whereas unions will provide better pay for their employees or better pay for members of the union, which means that these managerial and ownership classes aren't going to make as much profit off of their companies. So another way to make sure the rich get richer is not only cut corporate and capital gains and income taxes, but also hurt unions so they don't have to pay their employees as much. And during this process, they're trying to tie the concept of American prosperity to this business prosperity. They say if the country is making money, then everybody is making money and everybody's happy. But much like we saw in the 1890s, this isn't the case. This concept of trickle-down economics really doesn't work. This is the first time these concepts are really presented to the American public. Well, supply side or trickle-down economics support this idea that, well, the government will cut taxes for the rich, who will then provide more jobs, allowing more people to work, who will eventually make money and access upward social mobility. They basically rely on the rich to distribute the funds or to distribute the gains that they've made from cutting taxes. They say, we'll leave the money in the hands of the rich and they'll equitably distribute it to the rest of the country. This is bullshit, obviously, as we saw in the 1890s. These capitalists like Carnegie and Rockefeller kept the fortunes for themselves, and we see huge economic stratification. The same debate continues today, right? It's Cal Coolidge who brings Andrew Mellon on as his Secretary of Treasury, and that's really when they start to support this concept of supply side or trickle down economics. That if the government cuts corporate taxes, this will lead to economic expansion that will eventually benefit all Americans. Everybody understand that concept of trickle down economics, Andrew Mellon and Cal Coolidge? All right. So in an ironic twist to this whole process, unions aren't going to give up and workers aren't going to give up on this idea of a more equitable division among employees in the managerial class. So it's actually because of them remembering the Gilded Age and these progressive ideals that many of these corporations start to offer what is known as sort of corporate welfare, right? Giving better provisions to their employees so that they don't join labor unions. You know, if we pay them a little more, maybe they'll be less inspired to join a union. This is also inspired by Ford, who was the first to sort of support this idea of welfare capitalism, right? This idea that we'll support our workers so that they don't go out and join unions, which will eventually hurt the economy, or which will eventually hurt the company because of these unions' demands. All right. So this pro-business government continues the resurgence of these laissez-faire economic practices. And it's really Coolidge that will start to enact the first isolationist legislation. The first laws dictated to isolationism, which was this big movement coming out of World War I. So they want to increase their exports, what we're selling abroad, while decreasing the influence of foreign companies on American markets. So you do that by increasing tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. If you charge companies more to sell their products in America, they're less inclined to sell their products in America. Well, at the same time, they're trying to promote exports, selling American products abroad. So this is a tenuous, sort of difficult process to promote American economic intervention and selling American products abroad while simultaneously restricting the importation of foreign goods through high tariffs. But at the same time, our economy is really humming because of the basis of manufacturing that we've established during the Progressive Era. Also, our financial sector is beginning to involve itself in lending money to European countries to help them recover from World War I. We lend billions to Germany to help them pay their reparations. Remember, they're forced to pay reparations for basically taking the brunt of the blame after World War I. So American financial institutions are very much involved and invested in the rebuilding of Western Europe. And also corporations really start to offshore more and more of their labor during the 1920s. All right, everybody understand the generality or the general nature of Republican economic policies in the 1920s?
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Great. All right, let's move on and talk about some social movements going on that are also very important in the 1920s. Civil liberties, the concept of civil liberties and definition of civil liberties becomes very important in the 1920s. Civil liberties are basically these rights that an individual can assert against a democratic majority or against a government system. So we start to see a coherent concept of these civil liberties take hold in the 1920s. So taking these tenets of unalienable rights defined in the Bill of Rights and defining legal protections of these liberties, right? Free speech is going to be at the forefront of this. And that's because free speech was infringed upon during World War I, right? We talked about the Espionage and Sedition Acts, where it became illegal to publicly criticize the government and our role in the war. Well, this is an infringement on the First Amendment, and in the 1920s, a lot of these civil rights advocates or advocates of these civil liberties are going to work to define how these liberties or to define these liberties in a court system. So this is often referred to as a legal precedence. So that's very important. And we're going to see a continuation of these censorship efforts into the 1920s. Customs and the post office and the federal government are involved in directly censoring what information Americans can obtain, can access. One of the most egregious examples of this is the book Ulysses, written by James Joyce. A very difficult book written by an Irish author, James Joyce. It's one of the first examples of what we would now call modernist literature. In the 1920s, we start to see a postmodern movement. You don't really need to know that for this class. But basically, the whole book is basically a metaphor which sort of parallels the Odyssey, and it's an existential book about a man walking around Dublin facing existential crises. But it brings about issues of socialism, and it talks about homosexuality, and it talks about certain sexual perversions. And so the government deems that it's pornographic, that it's too explicit for Americans to read. So this is the government directly involved in determining what is too obscene or explicit for Americans to read. This is, again, an infringement on Americans' civil liberties tied to the freedom of speech or freedom of expression or freedom of the press. This will also apply to, articles that are written that the government feels are seditious, the disrupting public order, right? We talked about this with Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger, that they were thrown in prison for saying vagina in public, things like that, although Emma Goldman was a radical. So the government is specifically involved, customs, with burning thousands of copies of Ulysses that are trying to be imported and sold to Americans. So civil liberties organizations that are arguing that the government doesn't have the authority to do this need to establish a legal precedence. They need to win a case in court that you can go back to and say, look, the government can't censor Americans from accessing certain books based on this precedence. And Ulysses is used to establish that precedence. And it's actually taken to court. I believe the case is the United States versus one book called Ulysses. And the civil liberty defenders actually win the case. And finally, by the 1930s, I think 1930 itself, the US is able to, or people in the US are able to actually read Ulysses. All right, 34, I'm sorry, is when they become the first, or when we first are able to access Ulysses. This will also apply to some odd parts of the industry or parts of American industries. Censorship against certain comic books becomes very popular. This again happens in the 1940s and the 1950s. But basically, the government is worried about Americans accessing information that could influence them to challenge the government's authority or to challenge our capitalist or democratic systems. The same censorship hits the motion picture industry in 1930. William Hayes is the president of the motion picture industry, sets up his own system of codes or his own set of codes to censor the movie industry, guidelines that prohibit, nudity, or I think one of them is if they kiss longer than 20 seconds, it's deemed obscene and Americans can't see it. But the most important aspect of this motion picture production code is that it deems any films that depict the government in a negative light as being obscene. So they censor films that depict criminals as heroes of the movie or depict somebody challenging government authority. Those are now censored by the Hays Code, which is an extension of this government censorship. And this is interesting because in the 1920s, gangster films are very popular. The original Scarface is one of the most popular silent films. And you also have this interesting sort of American obsession or interest in the criminal celebrity. This becomes much more popular after the stock market crashes in 29, and Americans start to celebrate people like John Dillinger and Lucky Luciano and these sort of criminal celebrities who have survived and flourished outside of the American system. So it's going to be a unique and interesting sort of war between these two sides as we get into the 1930s. An interesting example or repercussion of this censorship effort was the Lost Generation, who were a group of writers, American writers, who left the country in the 1920s to avoid American censorship. They all moved to Paris. Started a commune in Paris among these brilliant writers. Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway is the most famous of these, John Dos Passos, F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm sure you guys had to read The Great Gatsby in high school, Hart Crane, E.E. Cummings. Some of these great American authors were forced to leave the United States and live in Paris so that they weren't censored. Their works, their writings weren't censored by the federal government. It's actually Ernest Hemingway who coins this term, the Lost Generation. And he's basically saying that this generation of people who were progressives have lost their fight as the Republicans took back over in the 1920s. And all of these progressive accomplishments are being reversed in the 1920s for the benefit of rich people and corporations. So yeah, Hemingway's an interesting example. He's celebrated the world over for his writing. He really is the one to sort of come up with this post-modernist style And they're an interesting example of the negative repercussions of this government censorship. All right, the ACLU is another important organization or another important aspect of this era. Established in 1920, they are former progressives and populists. They are pacifists who opposed the war. They were progressive businessmen who wanted to define what these civil liberties truly were. This was largely due to the outrage over the Espionage and Sedition Acts. It was established in 1917 and strengthened in 1920, became the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, in 1920. And like I said, they wanted to establish a precedence to defend American civil liberties in court. So by the 1930s, we start to see the tide slowly change away from this idea of Espionage and Sedition Act, that it's un-American to challenge the government, that American censorship is okay if it's in this sort of patriotic trend, or if it's for American security abroad, et cetera, et cetera. The ACLU says, no, it's not. These rights are defined in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, specifically the First Amendment, and you can't infringe upon those civil liberties. The ACLU is still in existence today. If any of you ever feel like you were discriminated against in the workplace, didn't get a job because of your gender or sexual orientation or race, employ the ACLU. They'll defend you in a court of law against, or defend you in a court of law if you feel like your rights are being infringed upon. All right, an important trial in this process is the John Thomas Scopes trial. John Scopes was a teacher, and in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, he was actually a substitute teacher who took over a class and taught the class about evolution. Unbeknownst to John Scopes, Tennessee had a law on its book pending in the 1920s that prohibited anyone, this is from the actual law, to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of men as taught in the Bible. That was literally word for word written into the Tennessee Constitution, prohibiting teachers from teaching evolution. The problem with this is that is not a separation of church and state, right? Schools are funded by the community different ways, either through property taxes, or some states use the lottery, some states use sales tax. So this tax is from the people to provide a public education for all pupils, for all people of a certain age. Since the people are contributing to make these public education institutions, you cannot legislate religious teachings into these schools. That wouldn't be a separation of church and state. Well, Tennessee's in the Bible Belt, right? This section of the South that is very heavily ingrained in Protestant ideologies. And actually, there were 15 states by the time of the John Thomas Scopes trial that had some legislation reflecting this legislation from Tennessee, that you couldn't teach evolution because it went against the Bible. So this provides an opportunity. The ACLU sees an opportunity here to challenge these state constitutions for infringing this separation of church and state. So they decide to support John Thomas Scopes. They bring in a man named Clarence Darrow to defend John Thomas Scopes, and the ACLU pays for his defense. This is a substitute teacher in the middle of rural Tennessee. Well, as the trial commences, the country starts to pay immense attention to this trial, because this is an opportunity to define what powers states have in dictating what can be taught in their school systems. On the other side, our old friend William Jennings Bryan decides to represent the prosecution. So you remember William Jennings Bryan was a populist, right? He ran against William McKinley in 1896 and lost, ran again in 1900. We talked about the Cross of Gold speech. where he supported the free coinage of silver and became sort of the biggest populist celebrity of the political party. Well, we also remember that they combined forces with Democrats in the South to try to challenge Republican dominance during the Gilded Age. Well, now we're 20 years later. William Jennings Bryan is actually proven to be what we would call a Protestant fundamentalist, where William Jennings Bryan believes the Bible is a literal history. He takes a literal interpretation of the Bible, right? Rather than believing that the Bible is a series of parables that are written to teach lessons, he believes that the earth is 6,000 years old, that, he's a creationist. He believes that this is an actual history of the world. So he represents the prosecution and exposes himself as a religious fanatic. Well, Clarence Darrow and the ACLU get to Dayton, Tennessee. The trial begins. And the first day of the trial, the judge stands up and says, and proceeds to say a prayer over the court. Again, this is a judge that is appointed by the people and paid for by state taxes. You cannot have him promoting certain religions in courtrooms. So Clarence Darrow knows, I'm screwed. There's no way I'm going to win this trial. We're in the middle of the Bible Belt. There's no way they're going to accept evolution. There's no way they're going to let my client off the hook for teaching evolution. On top of that, the judge tells Clarence Darrow, you can't bring any scientists up to the stand, because he's also a Protestant, a religious fanatic who believes that evolution isn't real. So he says, you can't bring evolutionary scientists up to the stand because evolution isn't real. So Clarence Darrow comes up with a new strategy, and he brings William Jennings Bryan up to the stand, the opposition's counsel, the prosecuting attorney. So by now, the whole country is paying attention to this trial. It's become a media circus. People are paying attention to it every day, reading about it in the newspaper. And William Jennings Bryan embarrasses himself. He shows that he knows nothing about science. Like I said, he believes the earth is 6,000 years old when it's indeed more like 10 billion years old. He constantly contradicts himself. He has a very difficult time on stand. And the newspapers are eating this up, ridiculing him publicly. It sort of paints the South as this sort of rural backwoods area that doesn't believe in science, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, the trial proceeds. It's kind of sad because William Jennings Bryan dies like a week after the trial is over, after being sort of publicly ridiculed. So it's sort of a sad end to his legacy. Oh my gosh, I have 8 minutes. Okay. So at the end of the trial, Darrow asks the jury to convict his client. He says, I know you're not going I know that you're eventually going to convict him, so convict my client so we can appeal this conviction up to higher courts. They appeal the conviction. At the end of the day, Scopes is forced to pay a $100 fine. The Tennessee Supreme Court eventually overrules the ruling. And so even though it's a small sort of incident about that regarding a substitute teacher in rural Tennessee, it has major implications for the ACLU to establish a precedent that states can't dictate teaching certain religious doctrination, certain religious ideologies in public schools. Everybody understand the John Thomas Scopes trial? Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So the book also gets into the second Ku Klux Klan. You guys need to understand that. The Klan has a reemergence in the 1920s, starting by a man named William Simmons in Atlanta. The second KKK is very much an anti-immigration organization. They are an anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish hate group. They're still very much anti-Black. The original KKK you guys learned about in 1301 is established to, or we also talked about it in here, is established to promote Jim Crow laws and to intimidate African Americans in the South. This is much more an anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish organization. It's much more politically active. They become a major political party in the 1920s, winning elections in local elections across the country. Even here in El Paso, we have a candidate run in 1922 for mayor of El Paso. He's defeated. There's a famous El Paso Times headline that reads, "El Paso is not a Klan town," the day after the election in 23. Unfortunately, the next mayor of El Paso is a Klan member. He's actually Tom Lee's father, who's a famous El Paso artist. Anyway, the second Klan is very much more politically motivated. They're a top-down approach. They are much more organized. They broadened their scope of hate to include Catholics and Jews, and they're very much more anti-immigrant, although they're still very much rooted in the South and a hate group towards African Americans. Okay, immigration restrictions in the 1920s. For the first time, the Congress passes the Immigration Law of 1924, which will restrict immigration into the United States. This is also when we get the Border Patrol, which is established to enact the Immigration Law of 1924. This will have a major impact on border town regions. It used to be an open, free-flowing border, but the Border Patrol is established to enforce the Immigration Law of 1924. This is also the first time the term illegal alien is entered into the American lexicon, which basically refers to somebody who is living under political borders that they're not a citizen of. And so this is again an extension of this isolationist policies of Republicans of the 1920s, right? Focus on internal domestic and economic issues, economic growth, restrict immigration. And it also has a racial aspect to it where we see a major advent of white nationalism in the 1920s as well, which will redefine American identity as being white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? What we would now call WASPs. These Republicans and isolationists believe that American culture should be dominated by white Protestants, which is going back, 200 years to these concepts that were also supported prior to the American Revolution, that American culture should be dominated by white Protestants. Again, the Ku Klux Klan, Second Klan, plays into this. They say that Jewish Americans and Catholic Americans aren't real Americans, that real American identity comes from your religious devotion to Protestantism and your cultural practices as a white, and especially white men. Okay, what else? There's quota systems put in place under the Immigration Law of 1924. We start to see some backlash against minority groups in America after World War I. German Americans are targeted. As we know, Germany took the brunt of blame for World War I. We see millions of German Americans change their name from Schmidt to Smith, or from Mueller to Miller. This is actually the reason Smith is the most popular name in America, because they're trying to hide under this guise of WASP identity, right? They want to present themselves as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, don't want to identify themselves as German Americans. This will happen to African Americans, Chinese Americans, several other groups as well. All right, guys, also make sure you guys read about the Harlem Renaissance, a great cultural renaissance, which produces a new identity for African Americans called the New Negro Movement. A man named Alain Locke is very important in this process. He publishes an article in the Survey Demographic magazine, where he describes new African Americans or African Americans in the 1920s as the new Negro, as they start to take pride in their racial and cultural autonomy, what makes them different from white American cultures. We also see that this is a major byproduct of the Great Migration. The Great Migration started during World War I, where millions of African Americans leave the South, coming into rural areas of the North, big cities in the North, urban areas in the North, big cities in the North, to take advantage of job opportunities for World War I. As they congregate in these big cities, it changes the cultural dynamics of these cities, and places like Harlem, New York become cultural meccas of the Black community. Then there's a cultural renaissance that takes place in Harlem, New York, that runs parallel to another cultural movement known as the jazz movement. And African Americans start to take pride in their cultural uniqueness through artists and authors and musicians, you know, Count Basie and Langston Hughes and, you know, vaudeville performers and eventually jazz musicians. So make sure you guys read about the Harlem Renaissance as well. All right, then comes the election of 28, and Herbert Hoover takes over. Herbert Hoover is very much going to support the same policies of Andrew Mellon, and we'll see that very quickly after Herbert Hoover takes office. He takes office in the beginning of 29, and by October of 29, the stock market crashes, leading to a global depression. And we'll start talking about causes of the depression next week, or actually after spring break. Questions for me, guys?
You said something right before talking about the New Negro movement, something that we needed to make sure to pay attention to, but you cut out at the same time. So can you repeat just that section, please? It was after German Americans being targeted.
After German Americans being targeted and before the New Negro movement?
Yes.
Did I give you a hint? Did I say anything? Can you give me a little more?
You cut out was the problem.
Oh, like my mic cut out?
Yeah, or my internet did something weird. But yeah, I like didn't hear you at all.
Okay. Does
So
anybody?
make sure you pay attention to blank.
Oh no! Did anybody else hear that?
I think it was the Harlem Renaissance is what she's talking about that you said.
Oh,
The
I
Harlem
thought that was after.
Uh-oh. I'm not sure.
I took notes. You said quota systems, minority groups, and then you talked about Germans being targeted, and then he started talking about Harlem Renaissance.
Maybe the relation to isolationism, this anti-immigrant sentiment, or its connection to the second Ku Klux Klan. It could have been that.
Yeah, it could have been that. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I'm sorry. Anything else, guys?
Not on my end. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, guys. Hang in there. Hopefully everybody's email will be back up soon. I'll respond to as many emails as I can once mine comes back up, but I've heard rumors that we won't get any of the emails. We won't be able to retrieve any of the emails that we missed while the system was down. So finish this week's work, you know, have a good spring break. And when we get back, we'll start thinking about the midterm and we'll proceed from there.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.